So please welcome John and Keith to the stage.
Thank you.
So, welcome. How do you like Nordic games so far?
It's really relaxed. It's much more relaxed than the UK equivalent, which I guess is developed.
Right.
You know. That's also hot though, but this is not as hot.
So yeah, we have Keith and John from CGA Studio, and they have a very special game here at Nordic Game Conference that we really would like to talk about. It's a virtual driving school, right? So how did you arrive at this kind of concept actually?
So we actually arrived at this concept as a response to a competition from the UK Driving Authority, the people who administer the driving test in the UK. So in the UK we have something called a hazard perception test, which is a a screen-based exercise you do, which is you have to kind of predict when something bad is going to happen in the video that you're watching. And there's kind of strong evidence that any country that has a hazard perception test has much safer drivers. But they wanted to look at doing the hazard perception test in VR. So that was the origination of the project quite a long time ago, was to build a little VR driving hazard test system, really. So that's where we started. So yeah.
So what was the result of taking part in this kind of
it was really good actually, because there were about 4 or 5 others. There were one other doing software and they kind of disappeared, so that was good. And then, because it's a really hard problem. No, it was great. We did some user trials and we had some really good responses. We created some horrible hazards on the road, to the extent, this was in VR as well, to the extent one guy pulled the headset off. And then we asked this very telling question at the end: has your experience in the simulation changed your behavior, your driving behavior? And quite a few of them said yes. And I think that's true. I mean, I think that every time I see a lorry parked on the side of the road, I'm always aware that something could be coming out there, because I've done that hazard about 1 million times in the simulation. So, yeah, and it does. It changes your perception of the road and dangers on the road, but in a safe way. Because often, I mean, I don't know about your own driving experience, until you've had one crash, you don't realise, have you ever had a crash?
You had 7 crashes.
I had several crashes, yeah. I really felt like being for the first time on board of a truck or behind the wheel, and totally.
I definitely hope it was rental or you have a good insurance, because it was interesting actually to see the whole game with the wheel and everything. You guys are very responsible, of course, and you have been working on this for approximately 6 years. What kind of thought process and also research went into this? Because this is not just a game for fun and games, but it's for an educational
and
purposes.
we were lucky enough to work with the people, DVSA, at the beginning, who really taught us a lot about, I'd use the word interesting driver behaviour and they would go, no, dangerous driver behaviour. I was like, and it does. It's a totally different. Obviously, it's totally different from making a game. In a game, the roads are very wide. You drive very fast. You don't indicate. You drive on the wrong side of the road. It's a very different experience. So and it, our roads are the correct width, which immediately makes it harder to drive. Fundamentally, and then we had to think a lot about that and how you steer the car. And it's easier with a wheel, but I've showed you it with mouse and other things. So yeah.
So when we learned about the game, we were really wondering, is there a business case for this kind of product? So what's your approach in this kind of way?
No, right.
So we've got several different business approaches. It is available to wishlist on Steam at the moment. So we do have a consumer-facing product that will be out at some point this year. We think this year. We think we're nearly ready. After 7 years, we're nearly ready. But we also do a lot of business-to-business inquiries. So we've dealt with a energy supplier in the UK who needs to train any business or government agency that needs to have people driving cars or training people to drive vehicles has a use case for doing it in VR, or on digitally. So we supply. a business in the UK, as part of the interview process, used to have the candidates drive with a real driver to see whether they were up to scratch from safety and driving awareness point of view. And obviously that's very expensive because you have to pay the real driver's time, then go out and drive in a car, and then you've got or van actually, and then you've got depreciation and insurance and gas costs on top of all of that. Whereas they've decided that they've asked us to come up with scenarios that they could build, that we could supply them with a kit of 3 monitors, the steering wheel, the pedals, and then they can assess the drivers for at least the first level, so that they can then include or disclude candidates that meet the requirement to go to the next stage. So it's quicker and cheaper for them, and that's so we do that with a business, and then we also supply the Scottish Police with a very similar piece of software, but that's aimed at old people, so that they get a bunch of people whose licenses. In the UK, you don't need to do anything to get your license after you turn 70. You just have to ask for it, and they will give it to you. And then they used to give it to you forever, but now every 1 to 3 years you have to request. But there's nothing, there's no tests. There's so you've got infirm people driving cars, and so the Scottish Police decided that they wanted to have a voluntary situation where they would take it to libraries or other public locations, and then have a bunch of geriatric old people come in and drive, and then ask the question that we'd asked earlier of, like, do you think you would have killed anybody today? And then so it's not a joke.
It's not a joke, yeah.
So,
but they didn't want that to be
Interestingly, they didn't want that to be a test. They wanted that just to be an experience. So there's no pass-fail, because they didn't want people to feel they were being, they're the police. They didn't want to feel you're being assessed.
but although it wasn't a test, it does open people's eyes to be like, oh, I could have done something. I'm not as good at this driving as I think I am. We all think we're great drivers, right? Everyone thinks we're a great driver.
So now that you mentioned the wheel and the VR headset, how did you guys prepare for people not getting too nauseous and motion sickness all the time? Because that must have been a huge challenge with a game like this.
I mean, that's always a challenge with VR. So we do have a VR version of the game as well, but that has some limitations because you need to orient yourself. Once you've got the VR headset on, it's difficult to see where your feet are for where the pedals are, or because when you're in any new car, you have to feel the space, and that's more difficult with VR. Newer headsets have kind of the combined view, so it makes it slightly easier, but they still have that core problem of 25% of people will feel nauseous when driving in VR. So sitting down.
But I think it's 20% of people feel nauseous when driving in a driving simulator as well. And I feel nauseous when driving a car. So it's like, I'm not driving when I'm a passenger in a car, but anyone who's a VR developer in the room knows that as soon as people are moving and the camera's moving, it becomes more tricky. Although we did do a game which was effectively a roller coaster driving game. That was much more nauseous.
Yeah, the speed because it's a driving instruction simulator, the speeds are much slower. It's less herring round corners. It's so it's a more sedentary pace, and so it kind of helps with that. It kind of when we release a game, we have a driving game, or we'll be demonstrating that tomorrow. And that's also being done in VR. That would make you feel more nauseous just because of the speeds involved. So it's a concern, but there's not much you can do about it, right? So
I'm not allowed to test the driving game in VR that we do, the racing game we do in VR, because I turned white last time I did it.
Yeah, now that we're like talking about VR, but also you mentioned the like 3-screen setup. I mean, a car consists of like a lot of like wheels, buttons, levers in the cockpit, right? I mean, I'm sure you're putting a lot of work into like figuring out what good controls would be, and in supporting peripherals maybe. So how does that work? Do you figure
Yeah, I
out
mean,
how
most of that is dictated by the peripheral manufacturers, right? So, if you look at the wheel we've got today is a Logitech standard one for PlayStation, and it has 12 buttons or so on. But we've came with a set of pedals, and there's 3 more buttons. We've come with a gear stick, and there's 6 more buttons. So, but we don't have to worry about air conditioning or heated seats or even the radio. So it is a more simplified version of what is in a car. And then also, weirdly, up until recently, there was no major wheels that were not aimed at racing games. So the biggest driving game on the planet is probably Euro Truck Simulator, and so finally it's a Chinese manufacturer, is coming up with a wheel aimed at not racing games, but is like a big truck wheel. So we've just imported some from first. We've imported the first ones from China, at least into the UK, maybe not Europe, but we have the first lot. So most of those button issues are dictated by the manufacturer. But then again, our programmers are nerds, and they added a virtual gear shift, so because they wanted to. So we add stuff that is needed, but we don't have to worry about windscreen wipers or anything like that. So it's just it's people feel under pressure when they're driving because, well, normally you've got an audience in this location. You would have an audience, and then suddenly it's like, oh, everyone's watching me, and you feel. Part of the problem with driving is you become so used to it that you then take it for granted, and that's where accidents happen, right? So, and then the beauty of the simulator is your brain it's not a comfortable situation. Maybe in 5 years' time, if you do it every day, then you would get into a comfortable situation. So, yeah.
To that point, in the very first project we did, it was important not to always have things happening because, like Keith says, it's the boredom of driving where you make mistakes quite often, and we want them to drive for 5 or 10 minutes with nothing happening, because then you've got to be aware for the moment that it does happen. So,
That would be very appreciated, at least. Also, taken from perspective that we were driving a UK car today, also in the other side of the road, so it was also reasonably that we should adjust to at least. Have you made an option where you can switch sides yet?
Yeah, that's one of the things we're doing before release. So obviously we're a UK company and all our clients have been UK, so primarily that's been our focus. But actually it's sort of more complicated than that. You've also got like the rules of the road. So American rules are the same as Korean rules, are the same as Japanese rules. But in Japan they drive on the same side as we do, and in Korea and America they drive on the other side. So you have to kind of we're trying to work out a way of. And then street signs change, kilometres, miles, and even that's not consistent. America drives with miles, but on the other side, it's just like, God, So we're having to try to work out a kind of pick and mix way of getting the localities really as you move around the world. And obviously the demand to learn to drive is from every territory, and it's more expensive probably here to learn to drive than it is in the UK. So it's like, so it's...
Yeah, definitely, because it's way different. Also, like America has a culture with driving, so it will be way different. Also, now you're talking about confusion. The mirrors, how did you solve that? Because, like Sasha mentioned, there's a lot of buttons and instruments when you drive a car, but there are also the mirrors.
Yeah, again, even that, we've done some stuff that isn't in the version we showed you. So we have it in the VR version. You can actually position the mirrors, like with your kind of finger, because it actually, it's part of your driving test, I think, in the UK, is to make sure you can see out of that mirror what's behind you. So being able to do that in simulation is obviously, part of that driving test. From a technical point of view, each mirror is another camera rendering the world, and then there's some tricks we play to save performance. But it's quite demanding, So we're our frame rates are okay, but we're having to do an awful lot of rendering, so it's a bit of a pain, performance-wise, you know. And our worlds also, you know, someone who's worked on a racing game, that you always know where the person's going. Whereas in the driving thing, they can go wherever they want, really, fundamentally, you know. So there's lots and lots of optimizations you can make in a racing game because you know the next 100 yards of what the person's going to do.
So when it comes to the game world, what are you providing with the game or with simulation? Is it like worlds you build yourselves? Is it like the real world? Is it like part of that part? What do you offer?
Again, we started off with really ambitious ideas, which is probably why we've taken so long. We thought you'd just be able to drag in the world, you know, and you can, and we've got tools to take OpenStreetMap roads and bring them in to create places to drive, but they're not really, they're kind of okay. And there are some really interesting games out there doing that kind of thing. There's a zombie game where it's the people who made, I can't remember what they're called, but they made a game called 911, where you had to be an emergency respond call handler, but you could put in your locality, and you do it around your locality.
Yeah, I heard about that, yeah.
Yeah, so they've done one with zombies now, so you can fight zombies in your locality. So there's some really interesting work people are doing with not dynamic worlds from real map data. So we have got all that systems in there, and we can do that. But quite often we just build the worlds, little simple, they're like little, you know, toy towns really, I suppose. Really. So, yeah. It's easier if we do that, but people sometimes want the real world. So.
Yeah, exactly. According to real world, I was wondering, what about something like Google Street Viewer, for example? Is it like, how do you collect your data for the navigation?
Yeah, it would. Well, okay. So first of all, we've written a whole navigation module. We have a sat nav in the game, which is like almost the same functionality as your sat nav, and it uses the same data potentially. It uses OpenStreetMap data. Google's world is closed, as I always shout at them whenever I go to a meeting where Google are on the stage. It would be lovely if we could integrate with the data sets like Google's, but from a development point of view, they're not really trustworthy because they've now opened their data 3 times, and each time they've shut it down about 2 years later. So you can't really build on it as a platform because you don't know if they're going to take it away. And there's a community effort called OpenStreetMap, which literally came from people like you or I in the early days of GPS going out and mapping our localities. And that's a much more reliable data source, so we tend to use that. But it means you don't get the... But, you know, the world's changing. There's lots of good 3D scanning coming. So, you know, you're seeing now... Saw one yesterday. It was like a drone flying over an area, but once they'd done the flyover, you could then move through it with 3D. So the world is changing quite quickly. So we'll be ready for it.
So your company has a fairly large portfolio of, I mean, you have like about 20 games, I think. Like, it's not only the virtual driving school, there are other racing simulations, but also match-3 games, stuff like that. So you have a lot of experience, obviously. You have seen some ups and downs, I'm sure. So what keeps you, especially at a time like this, where it's, at least for other companies, it's not looking as good, maybe. What keeps you going? What keeps you making games and continuing on?
I mean, first of all, we saw this earlier than everyone else because we're a micro publisher. You know, I can tell you the date that it all started. You know, it's like, you know, you can see the sales, great. Woo, no, there's no sales now. It's like, okay, that's quite scary. So, you know, that's why, from a business point of view, we've now gone back we originally were a mobile games publisher, and that's why we've gone back to mobile. But, you know, everyone here is the same. Making games is magic. It's making magic, you know. Literally making something out of nothing. There's nothing better in the world, you know. So.
Yeah, so I remember when I left King and my mum was asking me why would I leave what was basically a secure job, very dull but secure job, when I said to my mother I'm not creatively fulfilled, and her response, that's not a thing, but I was just like, no, it is. And so I went and then I started a new studio, and it was a big gamble. I mean, I did have backing, but, you know, it was still a big gamble. And so I think the thing that for me is I love making games. You know, I've always liked making games. You know, I've been doing it for 20 years. I've been doing it all this century, right? You know, because I'm old, right? So it's fun and interesting, but I think you've got to be flexible. I think this is why especially in John's part of the company. So John and I are business partners, but we are doing like 3 quantum projects. We're doing a 5G project. We're doing all using game technology, but not necessarily just doing games. And so I think that's one reason why we've survived, is just by... And it's another reason why we've got 20 games in our portfolio, is because we want to we're like... Being an independent studio for 20 plus years is hard. And so to keep going, you have to be... you have to be slightly crazy. So the reason John and I work so well together is because we are both slightly... It's like the only person I think John could work with and trust would be someone like me who's like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. It's a little bit chaotic. Managed chaos is what we like to talk about. But we both just like making games, right? And so that's why we do it. There's probably more money in fintech, but it's like, who wants to do that, But then as a game designer, I do spend my life in Excel, so, I do end up doing really dull stuff, right, And, we've made a match 3 game, and I made 600 levels in 4 weeks, right? That was hard work, so, but fun. But it did bear me out, right? So it's kind of...
I should make a point on that. We don't really crunch. I mean, we do crunch occasionally, but we recognise that when you've gone over about 2 weeks, that's not really sustainable. So at that point, we were like, oh no, you're just going to have to take a week off because it's just not right. I'm always haunted by the story of the guy who worked on, what was the Molyneux Fable, the very first Fable. There's a guy, it's like a nightmare story. He does 20 months of 15-hour days, and he never works again. Not just in the games industry, he never works again. And so I think the fact that we move at a slower pace sometimes, we can crunch a little bit, but that's how you keep going. Because like most people of my age, frankly, in the games industry, are burnt out and gone. And I think if I'd stayed in Sony, which is where I started, I'd be gone. I wouldn't be in the games industry anymore. So it's like
All right. Unfortunately, we already have to wrap it up. Thanks so much for being on stage. Please give a nice round of applause for John and Keith from CGA Studio Games. Thanks so much.